We are going to hear from Mr. Frank Martinelli in regards to getting to root causes of poverty through systems-informed advocacy. What will happen during the presentation, Frank's going to take it over once I sit down because he knows all about this and we're going to let him teach us for the next hour. But in between him, we'll do some question and answers. If you have questions, please say them loud enough so that the people on virtual can hear. Virtual, I need your questions in the chat room. So please do that for me, or you can also put your questions on the session page in the Hoover app. So I'll be checking all of those. But without much more to do, I want to just give you a little brief synopsis of today's session. Just a brief synopsis. This session will be especially useful to nonprofits that are not currently engaged in advocacy and seek credible information on this critical topic. Why is that? Because sometimes in our efforts to uncover root causes of poverty that we seek to address, we learn that there are existing laws, regulations, or policies that hurt the people we serve. We can then take action through advocacy to change or eliminate such laws, regulations, and policies, thereby removing the causes of conditions that lead to poverty and trauma. There are 6 topics that are included in today's session, which I believe Mr. Martinelli will be talking about. I will let you hear from him. Please give him a round of applause. Thank you so much, Frank, for being here.
Requested teas at restaurants.
Thanks a lot, Dana. Well, you can see the title, Getting to Root Causes of Poverty Through Systems-Informed Advocacy. And I want to start by saying that this is the right time to be talking about advocacy in our community. The continuing impact of the pandemic, the economic disruption and hardship experienced by so many people in Milwaukee, in particular, the people that are served by SDC, and the renewed and long overdue calls for racial and economic justice make advocacy so important and really the right thing to be focusing on today. So let me just start. We're going to talk about what is advocacy. We're going to talk a little bit about what the law actually allows nonprofit organizations to do in the way of advocacy. We're going to really spend some time talking about why nonprofits need to engage in advocacy. I mean, the fact is that many of us, for all the right reasons, really focus our attention, our work on delivering services, direct services to individuals in need. And we have to keep on doing that. There's no question about it, but it's not enough. At the same time, we're providing services to individuals in need. We have to really figure out together, why are all of these people in need in the first place? And that typically leads us to some of the underlying systems, the economic system, the political system, the education system, healthcare, criminal justice, the systems that don't work for so many people. We're going to talk about the difference between what is referred to as transactional change and transformational change. We're going to talk about the roles that board and staff can play in advocacy, and in particular, the roles that board members can play. We're going to talk about what I refer to as organizational entry points for making the decision to advocate, to do advocacy. If we're like many nonprofits, it's not something that we do. And so there's a big decision to be made. We need to talk about some of the places in the life of an organization where it's a little bit easier to talk about something like advocacy that is new to a lot of us. And then lastly, I want to talk a little bit about the organizations that are available to help. That's certainly the good news. If you're new to advocacy, if you want to get started, the good news is there are a lot of quality organizations that are there wanting to help you figure it out. I want to also mention that beginning in this year, 2021, SDC launched what is being called the Advocacy Initiative. I'm a member of the team that is working with advocacy, working with SDC to figure out ways of equipping SDC to do more advocacy. And the plan is to launch the initiative by the end of this year. So let's start with a definition. What is advocacy? First, let me say that there are typically three forms that advocacy takes: broad advocacy, legislative advocacy or lobbying, and election-related activities. And let's talk about all three. First, broad advocacy. These are activities whose purpose it is to educate decision makers, the media, and the community and the public about issues that are important to the mission of your nonprofit. The second form of advocacy, legislative advocacy or legislative lobbying, includes drafting legislation, working for or against a specific piece of legislation or ballot measure. And then thirdly, election-related activities, nonpartisan voter registration, education, getting the vote out. I'll talk a little bit more about it in just a moment, but regardless of the form of advocacy that we engage in, the important thing to keep in mind is that it has to be nonpartisan. So there are a lot of things that we can do, and I'll talk more about those in just a moment. The one thing that we can't do as nonprofits, as tax-exempt nonprofits, is to engage in partisan political work. More on that in just a moment. This graphic, and let me also mention that on the app, there are a couple of files. There are a couple of resources that you can download if you haven't already. The graphic that we see right now on screen is a graphic that was put together by two organizations in Michigan, as a matter of fact, the Minnesota Council of Foundations and the Minnesota Association of Nonprofits. I like to use it when I talk about advocacy because it reminds us that advocacy takes many, many different forms. A lot of times when we hear the word advocacy, we might think of legislative advocacy, we might think of voter registration and education, and clearly those are two important forms of advocacy, but there are a lot of other forms of advocacy that are important. And I think sometimes I'll ask the question, which of these activities has your nonprofit already engaged in? You may be thinking that, well, we've never done advocacy. And in fact, it's very likely that you have. It may have taken one of these other forms: educating the public, educating policymakers and decision makers, the media about the work that you do, about the need for change. That's advocacy. So I think in many cases, a group already has some advocacy under its belt. It's not starting completely from scratch. And so that experience can really be built upon if the organization decides to engage in more advocacy. I want to talk a little bit more about what the law allows the tax-exempt nonprofits to do. For the most part, it's great news because it's a long list of things that the law allows us to do. These are the things that are definitely okay in terms of the law, in terms of IRS regulations, and we've talked about some of them already. Educating the public and decision makers about our work as long as it's done in a nonpartisan fashion. Sharing information about how the public dollars that we receive or would like to seek can impact our work and increase our ability to serve our community. And then communicating how the broader issues that we engage in as a nonprofit, how those impact our mission and the people that we serve. All of this definitely okay. And as I suggested a moment ago, many of these forms of advocacy are things that many of us are already doing. Okay, the second list. Okay, but check the fine print. There are a couple of limitations, a couple of things that need to be complied with, but for the most part, it's more good. There are many things that we can do to engage in advocacy. We can do voter education, registration. We can do candidate forums. We can name legislators who support or oppose a specific piece of legislation. We can do limited lobbying on behalf of our own organization. Again, the only stricture, the only limitation is that this kind of work cannot be partisan. We can educate people about the candidates. We can't tell people who to vote for and who not to vote for. And then the very last item on the screen, I think, is really important. We can do lobbying and campaigning as private citizens, and it's unlimited. I'll use myself as an example. I am a member of a nonprofit, a membership organization. And let's say, as an example, that nonprofit is working to promote a piece of legislation that we feel will benefit the community. I can call up my representative. I can identify myself as one of their constituents. I can say, I'm calling because I support this piece of legislation and I encourage you to support it. I can do that as a private citizen. I'm not speaking on behalf of the organization, so there is no limit to what I can do as an individual. That's important. And then the very last list, and the good news is there are only 2 things on the list. These are the things that are definitely not okay for tax-exempt nonprofits to engage in. And we've talked about this already. Organizational support or opposition to a candidate or a set of candidates. We just can't do that. And then spending, if we receive federal grant funds, we can't use those federal grant funds to do lobbying. So there are some limitations, but again, for the most part, it's a long list of things that the law says we can do as tax-exempt nonprofits. I want to talk a little bit more about why nonprofits need to engage in advocacy, and we've touched on some of these things already. The first, advocacy advances our mission. We provide direct services because those direct services reflect our mission or our purpose in the community. Advocacy, think of it as just another powerful way to put our mission out there in the community. So it advances our mission. The second, the people that make decisions, whether they're legislative leaders or other kinds of public and private leaders, they need our expertise. If they're going to make great decisions, especially decisions that have impact on the people in our community, those decision makers really need a sense of what's going on in the community. Organizations, nonprofit organizations, especially community-based nonprofits, are there on the ground day after day, month after month, year after year. Valuable information that will help those decision makers make better decisions. We all know, I mean, it was true before the pandemic and it will continue. Government decisions impact the funding and the regulation of nonprofits. So that becomes another compelling reason to be there doing advocacy to advance our causes. The other benefit to advocacy is that it's a way of building relationships with decision makers. In some cases, developing brand new relationships with decision makers we've never been involved in before. In other instances, it's deepening the relationships that we already have. Those deepened relationships mean that we can exert more influence on the decision making of those leaders. And then the last but not least, and I mentioned this at the very beginning, it's important that we continue to provide direct services to the people that are in great need. So that can't stop. But direct services to individuals alone don't change the unjust underlying systems that create the need for direct services in the first place. So what I'm really saying is we have to do both. Direct services by themselves are not enough. And I would argue that advocacy without direct services is not enough. We need to do both. And the problem is too many of us are not doing the advocacy. So these are some of the key questions. And I'll start with what is not the question. The question is not, should we provide services or do advocacy? It's not an either or. The real questions are, how can advocacy expand our mission impact? In addition to the good work that we do in the form of direct services, how can advocacy increase that mission impact? Secondly, how can telling policymakers and the public about our cause through advocacy enhance some of the other things that we're already doing as an organization? And then thirdly, because one size doesn't fit all, there is so much variety in the nonprofit sector, what is the right balance among services, advocacy, and other activities for our organization? That's an important question that needs to be answered. I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the key ideas that will make advocacy more impactful. So the foundation of what I'm referring to as systems-informed advocacy, advocacy that really gets to the deep root causes, advocacy that challenges and changes the systems that hurt people now. What are some of the key ideas? The first is that advocacy needs to be rooted in our overall agency plans. It can't be something off to the side. It's too important. It has to have a central place in our strategic plans, the blueprint that organizations put together that describe where we're headed as an organization, what our key priorities are over the next couple of years. The second is we have to begin looking at advocacy as what I refer to as a mission impact multiplier. I mean, you can almost think of it as a formula. Direct services, add advocacy to that equals increased mission impact. We're going to have more impact if we're doing both things. This is really important. Advocacy informed and inspired by the authentic voices of the community. I mean, certainly in the last year and a half, there is a renewed understanding that too much of what we do is not really informed and inspired and guided by the people that we're presuming to serve. And so if we're going to do effective advocacy, it needs to really reflect the true voices of the people that we serve. And I think historically, too much advocacy has been sort of a top-down affair. We need to really hear from the people that we're serving as well. And then this is the idea that I really want to spend some time talking about, that expression that I've begun to use, systems-informed advocacy, is really rooted in this fourth idea, the focus on systems change, a focus on changing unjust underlying systems that create the need for direct services to individuals. And again, I'm talking about the economic system, political, healthcare, criminal justice, education. Those systems that work for some, but don't work for a lot of people. So a focus on changing those systems. And this is where I'd like to talk a little bit more about transactional change and transformational change. It's important to really understand the difference if we're going to do systems-informed advocacy.
Hey, how are you?
Let's start with
Good.
transactional change. Transactional change is what a lot of us do. And as I've already suggested from the beginning, we have to do it. It's about working within existing systems, and it's, for the most part, focusing on individuals individuals and often families. And when we're operating in the transactional mode, the key question, the question that we're really asking ourselves is, why is this individual person or family poor? That's really the question when we're in the transactional change mode. And if that's the question, the logical answer is, what can we provide to them to address their individual and family poverty? Transactional change. Transformational change focuses on the systems, and those systems, as I've suggested, that don't work for a lot of people in our community. They're more, we're looking at more fundamental changes when we talk about transformational change. If we're able to achieve transformational changes, they last longer because they're at a deeper systems level. And when we're operating in transformational change, we're asking ourselves a very different question. The question we're asking ourselves in transformational change mode, why is there persistent and widespread poverty in Milwaukee? We're not talking about one poor person. We're not talking about one poor family. We're asking ourselves, why is there so much of it in our community? And why, in spite of our best efforts, is it not going away? What is it about the way Milwaukee, for example, is structured that results in persistent and widespread poverty? And when that's the question we ask ourselves, we're immediately led to thinking about what are those systems that aren't working, and because they're not working, a lot of people are affected. It's more than one individual and family, it's many, many, many. And in spite of our best efforts, it just won't go away. If we're going to pursue transformational change, change at this deeper systems level, we got to be clear, first of all, about what systems are we going to focus our efforts on. There are a lot of systems. Especially important, we need to take steps to identify the root causes of poverty, because that knowledge of deep root causes is going to lead us to ideas about transformational change. And then I think another part of the puzzle, we need to know the difference between root causes of poverty, especially the deep root causes of poverty, and the symptoms or the effects of living in poverty. We need to be concerned about both, that's for sure. But if we're going to pursue transformational systems change, we need to know the difference. So what systems are we talking about? I think a lot of times when we hear people, including ourselves, talking about systems change, the need for systems change, often we're talking about the systems that deliver services to individuals. So we'll be talking about how can we increase access to direct services. That's important work, but that's not the focus of transformational change. The system that we need to focus on in the pursuit of transformational change, again, are those underlying systems that don't work for many people and create and maintain the need for services and restrict access. And you know, I feel compelled to say that all of this is important. We need to be looking for ways to improve service delivery systems. But that is not enough. We also have to figure out what underlying systems need to be changed in order for some of these wicked problems eventually to go away. I know that there are a lot of different ways that we define poverty. I think one of the important ways to define it, and sometimes we don't talk about this enough, is the definition that you see on the screen right now. I or my family don't have enough money to meet our most basic needs: housing, heat, food, water, healthcare, quality education, childcare, and so many other things. So I don't have enough resources in order to meet those needs. This next graphic is my effort to connect systems thinking, some of the tools and techniques that we use to identify root causes, to connect that to using our knowledge of root causes to begin to design more effective services, more effective advocacy strategies, and more effective community organizing, so that the hoped for impact of all of this is change in those systems that are not working for a lot of us. So it begins over on the left side of the screen, using systems thinking tools, and we're going to look at a few of those in a moment, to do root cause analysis. These are some tools that allow us to really pinpoint what are the deep root causes of poverty. And then we apply those tools and we do it together. This is not something that we do by ourselves. It's something that we have to do together. We discover what those deep root causes of poverty are, and it's that shared understanding of what the deep root causes are that position us to take further action. The next, as we continue to move from left to right, systems informed action. So we've done the root cause analysis. We've come to a shared understanding of what the most important root causes are. And now we design actions to address those root causes. And then over on the right, systems change. The point of it all is for things to really change and for people, large numbers of people, to benefit from the work that we're doing. Let's talk a little bit more about this progression. Let's start with a definition of root causes. I've been using that expression for quite a bit. Here's a definition offered by the Building Movement Project, a group based in New York that provides support and services for nonprofits that want to engage in more advocacy for social change. This is their definition of root causes: underlying factors and forces that create community problems and make those problems likely to persist, even though services may be in place to help individuals and families meet their immediate needs. So certainly not the only way to define root causes, but I think it's a powerfully clear definition that will help us. And getting to root causes, that process of getting to root causes often allows us to uncover laws, policies, and systems that hurt the people and the communities that we exist to serve. That's the power of coming to a shared understanding of what those root causes are. Another way of thinking about root causes is the image or the metaphor of the iceberg. And one of the things that I really like about the symbol of the iceberg is that even if we've never done root cause analysis, even if we've never done systems thinking about why problems don't seem to go away in spite of our best efforts, all of us have heard people talk about the tip of the iceberg, We've heard people talk about it, and we use that expression ourselves. When we're trying to explain to somebody that, you know, there's more than meets the eye. This problem that we're looking at, whether it's a community problem, whether it's an organizational problem, there's more going on. We can see the tip of the iceberg, it's above the water. But as we know, most of the iceberg is below the water. The Titanic didn't sink because it hit the tip of the iceberg. It sunk because it hit part of the iceberg that could not be seen. So the tip of the iceberg, most of us start with what is above the water, so to speak, so that when we're thinking about how can we direct programs and services to the people that are most in need, we look for signs of poverty. Who are the people that are hungry? Who are the people living in substandard housing or facing eviction? Who are the people that are in poor health? So what we can see, it's sometimes referred to as the level of events. It's in our face. It's undeniable. It's right there. It's above the water. But in doing root cause analysis, and especially using this image of the iceberg, we need to go below the surface. And we begin to identify the factors, the forces that contribute to the hardship that individuals are having that we can observe in our community. That knowledge of contributing factors can help us figure out how to more effectively meet the needs of the people that we're hoping to serve. But we have to go deeper still. We have to understand what's causing those contributing factors. And that's where we get to the underlying root causes. A couple of examples. Poor health outcomes. Especially in the last several years, some really important work here in our community and throughout the country has been done to identify what are referred to as the social determinants of health. Some of the factors and forces that contribute to good health or the lack of good health.
Oh, okay.
Important work. But why
Yeah, he
are
does,
there
yeah.
social
Right.
determinants?
I can-
What causes the social determinants? The underlying root causes. And I think using this example, it begins to get us into conversation about the US health system. Systemic racism and sexism. Income and wealth inequality. Our low wage, no wage economy. We need to really grapple with those deep root causes. And of course, the difficulty is that they're not as visible as the symptoms. We're talking about the bottom of the iceberg. But if we're going to begin to move in the direction of collective systems-informed advocacy, we need to really come to a deeper understanding of those root causes. Another example, in our community and really throughout the country, there has been renewed, in fact, not renewed, but a new understanding that is growing about the impact of dysfunctional systems on human beings. The traumatic effect that occurs. Again, we understand that there are a number of causal factors that contribute to trauma. But again, we have to understand what are the causes of the determinants of trauma. Again, just another example of going deeper. So we have to, and SDC and so many other organizations are stunning examples in our community. We have to provide trauma-informed care to children, to adults. We have to provide trauma-informed care, and we have to figure out what are the deep root causes of all of this trauma. Again, the point I'm trying to make is that it's not an either or. We have to do both. And as a community, we are not doing enough of that deeper root cause analysis leading to actions, including advocacy, to really get at the heart of things. We want these problems to go away. We want to solve these problems, not just manage the extent of the impact. So again, some of the same things we talked about: racism, income and wealth inequality, the low wage, no wage economy, those all figure in, and we have to start working on those more than we have in the past. So I want to just sort of emphasize this point. By now you've heard me say we need to do both plenty of times, so I hope you know that's where I'm coming from. But in the absence of enough of this deeper root cause analysis work, we need to just make sure that we're understanding how we distinguish those deep root causes from some of the effects or symptoms. And the example I'd like to offer, the lack of sufficient resources to pay rent on time is not a root cause of poverty, I would suggest.
Hello, dear.
At the same time, the lack of sufficient resources to pay rent is a factor that reinforces or intensifies the conditions of poverty. So I think that that's a distinction that is an important one. We need to do both. We need to address the symptoms, and we need to get to the root causes. So what are the root causes is one of the important questions.
Hi.
And what are the factors that reinforce or intensify the conditions of poverty is another important question. So how do we get to root causes? There are a number of, I would call them user-friendly tools that enable us, again, this is something we do with other people, not alone, that enable us to begin to arrive at that deeper understanding. If anyone attended the workshop yesterday, delivered by Phyllis Richards and Jerica Broekling from the Alliance, in fact, you might want to check the recording on the app, because they also talked about some of these tools for getting to root causes. One is called the Keep Asking Why worksheet, and I think you can probably see why it's called Keep Asking Why. We want to get below the surface. We want to begin to understand the rest of the iceberg. Keep asking the question, why? Why is this happening? And then ask it again and again and again. Literally, we're going deeper and deeper and deeper. Here's an example. In our community, a lingering problem, the high school dropout rate. We ask ourselves, why is that happening? The initial reaction, the initial answer often is youth are making bad choices, schools can't keep student interest. Why is that happening? Disenfranchised communities with schools that are under-resourced. Why is that happening? A lack of equitable school funding in poor communities. Why is this happening? Poor people lack power, the power to influence those decisions. Now, I realize I'm focusing on a very complex problem. There's certainly more to the story, but I'm just trying to illustrate that sometimes the easy way to start that conversation about about deep root causes is to use something like the Keep Asking Why worksheet. Another, Lack of sufficient resources to make rent. Why is this happening? Lack of sufficient resource to pay rent on time. Why? Low wage employment that doesn't produce sufficient income. I'm working full time. In fact, I'm working more than one job and I'm still poor. Why is this happening? A lack of living wage jobs in our community. Why is this happening? That's part of the process, to just keep asking that question. And the key here is that asking this question, getting to the deep root causes, all of a sudden the light bulbs begin to go on. And that's why it's so important to engage in this with other people. We begin to get new insights about what we might do to really address some of these deep root causes. This is another example of a worksheet that can be used to identify root causes. Again, the app has the full PowerPoint presentation. But in this instance, it's a 3-column worksheet. Over on the left, as an example, we ask what condition or the symptom of poverty that we seek to address. We're going to see an example of the worksheet filled out in just a moment. The middle column lists some of the root causes of the condition or symptom that we've identified. And then in the third column over on the right, again, we ask the same question, list the factors that are the reason the root causes we listed in the middle column don't go away or persist. So again, just another way of asking why multiple times. It will always increase our knowledge. And here's an example. I know that for those of you that are actually in the last row, it may be too small. But the example of that worksheet filled out, the condition in the in the left column, lack of sufficient resources to pay rent on time. The middle column, what are some of the root causes of that lack of sufficient resources? Low-income households lack sufficient financial padding or rainy day funds to cover emergencies. Low-wage employment that doesn't produce sufficient income to cover basic expenses. And then in the right column, again, asking the question, lack of living wage employment, and then lack of living wage jobs, which disproportionately affect people of color, lack of education, which also disproportionately affects people of color. Again, you can look at these materials in the resources that you'll find on the app. But I think the message here is there are tools that we can use to begin this conversation. So I'm going to just move a little quickly through some of these other slides. We need to ask ourselves, why are more nonprofits not engaging in advocacy? And there are many, many reasons. There are 3 that I'd like to single out. One reason more nonprofits don't engage in advocacy is the belief that the law doesn't allow us to do so. But I think we've seen that, in fact, the law is very clear. Advocacy is something that is allowable. Another barrier that sometimes gets in the way, we're fearful that some of our donors or funders or even board members will oppose it, will resist work that really strives to get to some of those deeper system causes. And then over on the right, another lingering belief, the belief that advocacy is mission drift for our organization. We do direct services, we don't do advocacy because it would be mission drift. I think the response to that is you would only do advocacy that advances your mission. So by definition, it's not mission drift. It's aligned with the mission. In a moment, I'd like to talk a little bit more about roles that board members can play, but I actually would like to right now, just bear with me. I'd like to just pause before we go any further. We've covered a lot of ground. Let's pause for a moment for questions, either from people here in the audience or from people that are participating in the session virtually. And Dana, I'll leave it to you.
Any questions in the room? Yes, ma'am. Can you just say it kind of loud? I'm sorry. Okay, if you can just say it kind of loud so the people in virtual can hear.
If you go to the conference app, the WAHOVA app, you'll find all of these materials. They're downloadable. And if you have any questions about them, my contact information is there. Feel free to shoot me an email or a call.
So there were 2 questions in the app. I think you answered along the way the first question, which was what causes poverty? And you went over quite a few things that are attributed to that. But the second question was, once we get to the root, how do we change the mindsets of the people that have been affected by it?
Changing the mindset of people is one of the goals of some of our advocacy. Before we can get decision makers to think differently about an issue, we need to educate them. We educate them so that we can change their mindset. There are a lot of inaccurate perceptions and views of why people are poor. Some of the advocacy, some of the public education, some of the education of decision makers is really aimed at changing their mindsets. I think, the question seemed to ask, how do we change the mindset of the people that are affected? Was that the question? Okay, for me, one of the things that immediately comes to mind is one of the big ideas that we talked about earlier in the presentation, that the kind of advocacy that we're talking about, if it's going to be effective, it needs to really engage directly the people that we're presuming to serve. And so while I didn't mention it earlier on, when we talk about taking the steps to identify the deep root causes of poverty, that's not just something that staff of a nonprofit or board members of a nonprofit need to be engaged in. I want you to think about the possibility of making this kind of work part of public meetings, community meetings, public hearings as well. I think that I will say this, it's an important question. I think that one of the ways we change the mindset of the people that are directly affected, the people who right now lack hope that things can be different, is to involve them in the discovery of what some of the root causes are. This information all of a sudden, not just for us, but for them as well, it begins to present new possibilities, that this is not magic, that all of these problems are affecting our community, that there are reasons, there are decisions that are being made or not made. There are conditions that we can change if we begin to use this knowledge of root causes to engage in action together. So I think that would be my response, but an important question.
So you can actually keep the mic. We're supposed to end at 3. I obviously go over some, but the ending, the closeout.
Got it. Okay. Well, I would propose, since we started at 5 minutes after 2, how about if we end at 5 minutes after 3? Okay, so about another 10 minutes. The question is the difference between lobbying and advocacy. And I would, my response would be this, that lobbying is actually a form of advocacy. But, you know, we talked earlier at the very beginning that there are 3 broad areas or forms of advocacy. One is, our definition is broad advocacy. Those would be the things that we do to educate the public, to educate decision makers, to begin to make them more aware of the extent of the problem and what the solutions are that we're advocating or supporting. Lobbying, again, is a form of advocacy where we're engaging in the legislative process. So that, for example, we're promoting, we're supporting a particular piece of legislation. And, you know, again, as we talked earlier, that is an allowable activity. There are some reasonable limits in terms of the amount of resources that we might direct toward legislative lobbying. But as long as it is nonpartisan, as long as we don't start suggesting, and here's why we need to vote for so-and-so, we just can't do that. The focus needs to be on the merits of the legislation. That so it's a different form of advocacy, but it is certainly advocacy. I want to talk just for a minute about what I refer to as organizational entry points for talking about advocacy. So for the organizations that have never done it, and for the organizations that maybe up to this point thought that advocacy wasn't allowable, let's for a moment just assume that they're beyond that they now know that it is something that we can do, but it's new. And a big decision has got to be made. We're going to be doing something that we've never done before. I think that that like any hard decision, we want to figure out where are the best, in a sense, places in the organization. What are the best times in an organization's life where it might be easier to begin the conversation about advocacy than another time. So just very quickly,
I believe my faculty advisor,
I think that in fact there are lots of examples. STC itself is an example of an organization that began the discussion about advocacy as part of their strategic planning process. You know, by definition, we're thinking about new things. So people are a little bit more receptive, a little less resistant to change. Another opportunity, another entry point to begin talking about advocacy is if our organization has decided to take a fresh look at our mission, our purpose statement. The conversations that we have about that might also provide an opportunity to talk about advocacy. Some of the others, when we're reviewing programs, when we're working on board development, I think that this becomes another opportunity, another place where deeper conversations can be had, in this case, with the board of directors. Executive transition, sometimes when we're bringing a new executive director on as an organization,
fantastic. Real thin.
That's an opportunity to talk about a number of new things, including advocacy. And then new funding opportunities. I think it's too early to tell how excited we should be about this, but in the wake of the pandemic and the renewed calls for racial and economic justice, more foundations, still not enough, but more foundations are beginning to position themselves to
Yes.
provide financial support for
Smash it.
advocacy
What's
and
that?
systems
Taco
change
salad?
work.
This
So
is
there may
what's-
be a request for a proposal
That's
that
good.
comes down the pike, and that could be an opportunity to
That
make
is really good.
decisions. I'm
You have
going to
other
move
people.
quickly through these last couple of slides because there is one slide I want to get to. Building internal capacity. I think the easiest way to say it is we can't do advocacy if we don't have the internal organizational capacity to engage in advocacy. So these are some of the elements or building blocks of that internal capacity, assuming that we've made a decision to begin to explore advocacy. One of the first steps is to establish a task force or a committee within the organization that will have some responsibility for that exploration. As we move forward, at some point, we have to decide how we're going to make decisions internally about what issues to advocate on, what form the advocacy should take. We also need to put an effort into training and orienting other people within the organization, and for that matter, within the community, about advocacy. We need to figure out, and this is part of the decision process, what issues are we going to advocate on? We need to develop an advocacy agenda or a platform, and then a work plan, the more detailed implementation steps to make an advocacy strategy actually work. And then I think for a lot of organizations that provide direct services, we have staff out in the community. I think another element of building internal capacity is to figure out how to integrate advocacy
They're
into the
expensive.
on-the-ground work that our field
They're
staff and
expensive.
program staff are doing. There are a lot of organizations that are available to help. You can find that information in one of the handouts on the conference app. I'd like to end with the following. I think that the kind of advocacy that we're talking about, if it is really going to have the impact that I think it can have in our community, these are a couple of things to keep in mind. First, we need to, especially those of us that haven't done advocacy in the past, we need to begin to look at it as a mission impact multiplier. It's not a sideshow. It's not a diversion from the other work that we do. It's right at the center. We need to figure out how we make advocacy the norm in the nonprofit community-based sector. Right now, it's the exception. Not enough of us are doing it. We need to begin looking at advocacy skills as important as some of the other skills that we teach our staff and board members. It needs to be systems informed, the way I've been talking about it. We need advocacy that allows us to really get at the deep root causes of the problems that are facing our community. And then finally, it needs to be collective. While it would be a better world if a few more nonprofits did advocacy, the real impact comes when a critical mass of community-based organizations begin to do advocacy together around a shared issue agenda. And so I'll leave it at that. For people that are interested in finding out more about systems thinking, root cause analysis leading to systems informed advocacy, let us know. You can contact us through the app because we're talking about convening some sort of a follow-up session of people that would like to learn more. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Frank, for that presentation. Again, this has been the second day and I've learned quite a bit. I got a lot of questions answered that I always feel like people don't answer, and you have helped. So I appreciate that. Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all so much for being here. I know we are going into the next session, which is basically the closeout, which starts at 3:30. But I would love for you to give him another round of applause, because this is why we're here. The summit is why we're here, to know what we're doing, to know what we're not
Don't you give
doing,
me
and
soap?
how we can effectively do things
This is a
together. So
sponge.
collaborations are always great. Understanding where we are always essential.
Just
So
scrub
I
sponge.
appreciate that. So with that, thank you guys so much. We will see you at the end, at the closeout. I hope you'll join us for the closeout as well, Frank. And then we have sessions tomorrow morning, and then it's the annual meeting. Thank you guys so much. Have a great afternoon.